traditional method involves some unusual ingredients like camel and cow dung.
अजरक दुनिया में जो प्योर अजरक जो हम बनाते हैं जो इस एरिया में बनती है वो दुनिया में कहीं नहीं बनती.
But these days, customers are buying cheaper machine-made copies of these shawls. We visited the small town of Pitcha to see how one traditional Ajrak workshop is still standing. Imran Sumro started learning how to make Ajrak from his father when he was 10, and they still work together today.
खुद को बहुत खुशनसीबी समझते हैं कि हमें मतलब मेरा जन्म ऐसे खानदान में हुआ जो अजरक सिंध की सकाफत को कैरी ऑन कर रहे हैं.
It all starts with stiff pure cotton called kora. Workers take the cloth to a nearby stream for its very first wash. They slap the cloth against the riverbanks repeatedly to squeeze out any excess water. Every single step is done by hand, so it can take almost a month to make one shawl. Then it's time for the most famous ingredient, gisi. Camels used to be common in Pitcha, but these days workers from a nearby town deliver the dung every day. It's mixed with water, baking soda and mustard oil to form a paste called saj. That's what gives Ajrak its musty smell and eventually makes the colors pop.
अब इसमें लगाएंगे तो ये जो कलर होता है ना, कलर इसमें अच्छा बनेगा.
It takes a full bucket to soak 25 sheets. They dunk the fabric into the saj, then coil it again and again to soak up the paste. The cloth is soaked and dried at least 4 times before it goes back into the river for another wash. But they never let the fabric fully dry.
थोड़ा सा उसमें वो वेटनेस रखते हैं. आप 100 सालों के बाद भी आप अगर देखेंगे तो उसमें से आपको खुशबू आएगी, उसमें से आपको बदबू नहीं आएगी.
After the raw fabric is treated for 4 to 5 days, it's finally ready to be stamped.
ये अजरक का मजमूई तौर पर चौथा प्रोसेस हो रहा है और प्रिंटिंग का पहला प्रोसेस हो रहा है और इसको बोलते हैं छुर यानी कि आउटलाइन.
One artisan creates the outline on all 40 pieces in the batch. There are only 3 to 4 traditional patterns that are still in use today, but the workshop can customize designs. A skilled block printer can finish 10 to 12 pieces in a day, but the hard work doesn't always pay off.
हमारे हाथ हम ये कहते हैं कि हमारे हाथ सोनेंगे, लेकिन मैंने इन सोने के हाथ वालों को मतलब जब वो बूढ़े हो जाते हैं तो भीख मांगते हुए भी देखा है और भूखा तड़पते हुए भी देखा है.
A high-end shawl from Imran's workshop costs up to $50, but you can pick up a machine version for about $1.
क्योंकि वो लेकिन हमारे काम में मेहनत बहुत है, काम बहुत है, इसलिए प्राइस भी बहुत ज़्यादा है. मतलब उसके हिसाब से जितने की वो देते हैं उतने उससे ज़्यादा हमारा कपड़ा आता है कॉटन वाला.
Still, many people can't tell the difference between real and fake ajrak, but there are some signs.
वो नकल वाला मशीन वालों का उतरता है, हमारा कपड़ा फट सकता है, कलर नहीं उतरता.
Imran says that's because they don't use any chemical dyes.
मसाले होते हैं जो मिक्सचर्स होते हैं वो जो मतलब वो हर्ब्स एंड शर्ब्स हैं, जड़ी बूटियाँ हैं. मतलब इसमें किसी भी तरह का कोई भी केमिकल यूजेज नहीं है.
For the next step called khat, workers fill the outline with black color. It starts to give the ajrak its signature look. Then a worker stamps an herbal paste all over the cloth so that dried cow dung can stick to the fabric. This process, known as khar, protects sections of the ajrak that shouldn't be dyed. Now the fabric is ready for its first dye. Slowly, each ajrak is dipped into this bubbly dye until it turns a deep navy. Workers take out the soaked sheets and lay them in the sun before they're washed again. next stage demands a strong fire. Imran's father Muhammad fills a bhatti or clay oven with water along with alizarin pigment and an herb known as sakun.
साकल नहीं होगा ना तो ये ढंग नहीं पकड़ेगा.
अभी पाकिस्तान में जो आता है ना वो इंडिया से आता है. इंडिया और पाकिस्तान के जब भी हालात ख़राब होते हैं ये महंगा हो जाता है. बीच में बंद हो गया था ये 2-2.5 महीने बहुत मुश्किल हो गया, बहुत ज़्यादा मुश्किल.
Then Muhammad repeatedly dips the adrak into boiling water. More and more pieces go into the bhatti. And eventually they're all left to simmer for at least an hour. Imran checks the pot regularly to make sure each piece is fully submerged. Other pieces are dyed in smaller pots. The patterns start to appear. A worker lays out the adrak by the river the next morning. Then the fabric is dyed, block printed, and washed again to enhance the colors. Each step leaves its mark, with the stark crimson contrasting with the indigo, black, and white. Archaeological records show that adrak has been made in Sindh for over 5,000 years. It dates back to one of the earliest civilizations of the Indus Valley, where Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism flourished. Priest kings wore the fabric over their shoulders in the ancient city of Mohenjo-daro in Sindh. Today, shawls like these are sold throughout Pakistan, but Sindh is still the heart of the craft. There are about 100 workshops in this part of the province that still make adrak the traditional way. Growing up, Imran learned about legendary adrak artisans, and some even belong to his own family.
नाम सुने, बड़े बड़े कारीगर गुजरे, तो 100 साल से तो उन लोग 100 साल तक के बंदों को तो मैं जानता हूँ. मेरे वालिद साहब का नाम है मोहम्मद आजम सुमरो, वो भी अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह मतलब इस एरिया के माने हुए कारीगर है.
But the glory days of this ancient craft are long gone. Cheaper, mass-produced shawls have taken over the market.
तो अभी जो फंक्शंस वगैरह होते हैं या जो भी मतलब जहाँ भी क्वांटिटी में चीज़ें चाहिए होती है ना अजरक, तो वो अब लोगों को वो सस्ते मिल रही है.
To keep up with competition, Imran's family business has diversified.
जो सूट बना लेते हैं, साड़ीज बना लेते हैं, स्टोलर्स बना लेते हैं, कुशन्स बना, मतलब आप अब जो चीज़ भी ऑर्डर करेंगे.
Another change? They've started selling directly to consumers instead of just to local shops, which kept some of the profits.
अभी वो नहीं है, अभी हम फ्री हैंड एग्जीबिशंस करते हैं, ऑनलाइन काम करते हैं.
The new business model has helped his workers too.
और जो कारीगर लोग हैं हमारे, जो मजदूर जो काम करते हैं, वो भी जो 300 रुपये कमा रहे थे मुश्किल से, अब वो 500-600. अगर कोई बंदा अच्छा कारीगर है तो 1000 रुपये भी कमा लेता है अभी.
Imran credits non-profit organizations for training his workers on different techniques.
और उसमें जो इंडिया वालों से भी जो कारीगर लोग हैं वो रश करते हैं और वो बहुत हमें बड़ा उस्ताद मानते हैं.
And he's hopeful that the adrak will continue to be cherished by many future generations.
सरवाइव करेगा, अब तो बिल्कुल करेगा, क्योंकि अब तो हम जो है मतलब हम लिमिटेशन में निकल गए हैं. हम अब अनलिमिटेड हो गए हैं.
The oldest bell foundry in the world has been using ancient techniques since the Middle Ages. It takes at least 3 months to make a bell by hand, and each one is unique. The workshop has survived nearly 1,000 years of wars and hardship, but it's a crisis of faith that's putting pressure on the business today. We went to Agnone in southern Italy to learn how this traditional bell foundry is still standing. The Marinelli family has been running the factory for 26 generations. Armando Marinelli sketches bell designs by hand the same way his ancestors did it.
Qui si fanno campane come si facevano 1000 anni fa.
Very large bells are cast in a pit like this, but it rarely happens nowadays. That's because the foundry only operates when there's demand. But the process of making smaller bells is pretty much the same.
Allora bisogna immaginare in questo momento 3 bicchieri, uno attaccato all'altro, rovesciati.
The bottom and the top cup create the shape of the bell. The middle layer looks exactly how the final bell will look, but it's made of clay, so it will eventually be destroyed to make way for the bronze. They start off by building the bottom cup, using bricks and clay.
Dobbiamo creare l'anima della campana, che è il profilo interno della campana.
It's a painstaking job to make sure the pile is level. Then, a worker slathers it with clay to create the middle cup, or what they call the false bell. A wooden ruler called the strickle sets the exact shape, height, and weight of the final piece. This is the part that will be destroyed later. But before we get there, they have to bake the clay from the inside out until it's solid. While the false bell dries, sculptors prepare the decorations. They can use pre-made plaster molds or cast new ones. They place the pieces of wax on the false bell. Next, they apply more clay to form the top cup, called the mantle. It provides the outside shape of the bell with the wax designs embossed into it. Once this dries, they lift the mantle to expose the false bell. Then it's finally time to destroy it to make way for the bronze. This is what a small-scale fusion looks like. Larger bells need a lot more bronze. Once the metal hardens, they lift the mantle and reveal the final bell. For smaller bells, they break down the mantle by hand. The family's attention to detail is clear when they forge the handle in iron. Finally, workers like Antonio Deli Quadri polish the finished bells until they shine.
Siamo una famiglia di collaboratori dei Marinelli da 150 anni.
He's been working here for 6 decades, and at 84 years old, he's technically retired, but he takes pride in tuning the bells. He also leads tours around the workshop. On average, a 100-kilogram bell costs around 3,000 euros, and since it takes months to craft a single bell, they only make a few a year.
Quando viene una richiesta dall'estero, dall'America, e ci chiedono una campana nel giro di 15 giorni, un mese, purtroppo noi dobbiamo dire non è possibile. Noi con il tempo non potremo mai essere competitivi.
The Marinellis still face competition from other foundries who have modernized. Many rely on heavy machinery and reusable molds. Armando says he could modernize like this too, but only as a last resort.
Creare un pezzo meccanico sarà veramente, non dico un fallimento proprio sotto un punto di vista diverso, quello della soddisfazione che può dare una campana di questo.
When the family business started, bells had a very important role in mass communication.
Allora, immaginate le campane senza la corrente elettrica, senza gli orologi. È una funzione fondamentale. La campana era la sirena, l'allarme, c'era un incendio.
Today, Marinelli bells ring from iconic places, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa and the Vatican. And it's this historical connection to the Catholic Church that has kept the foundry running for so long. The church has accounted for about 90% of the foundry's business in recent decades. In 1924, Pope Pius XI granted the Marinellis an official recognition.
Questo qui è lo stemma vaticano che ci è stato dato dal Papa, e lo stemma pontificio, questo qui, Andrea Marinelli, Agnone, Molise.
And they've cast many celebratory bells over the years, like the one for Pope John Paul II's Millennium Jubilee.
Ci emozioniamo sempre perché è un'emozione che va oltre ogni pensiero di piacere. Non si può dire quello che uno prova con la sensazione di questo santo che è venuto a casa tua.
But the foundry has also seen desperate times throughout its long history. Nazi troops occupied it in World War II.
Penso sempre ai miei nonni che hanno vissuto la guerra, un periodo bruttissimo perché si era fermato tutto, rompono le campane per fare e allora diventano i cannoni.
And then a fire in the 1950s destroyed the original foundry and many of its historical records. Now, in the 21st century, Armando is looking for ways to keep the business afloat.
La passione che ci fa fare tutto in vista della nostra fonderia. Adesso che la Chiesa sta soffrendo un po' di questa, della fede, dei fedeli che seguono la Chiesa.
Christianity's popularity is declining in many countries across the world, especially places like the US and Western Europe that have historical Christian majorities. With fewer churches being built, demand for bells is low. Also, quality bronze bells like the Marinellis can last centuries. So the family is diversifying. They've created a museum inside the foundry to attract more tourists. They also take some lucrative sculpting jobs. Armando's son, Ettore, is one of the foundry's sculptors.
Io sono la 27ª generazione e tutte queste generazioni mi pesano molto sulle spalle. Essendo giovane, la mia mente spazia anche altre cose più innovative. Ovviamente adesso ci sono i computer, le stampanti 3D, io non è che non ci ho pensato a queste cose, ci penso tutti i giorni. È un po' anche una paura di mandare all'aria 1000 anni di storia.
So for now, he's sticking with making all these designs by hand.
Tra me, mio fratello e ho altri 2 fratelli, il figlio di zio Pasqualino, la figlia di zio Pasqualino, sicuramente la 28ª generazione penso sia salva. Poi sono più preoccupato per la 29ª, 30ª.
Overall, the family's focus is on creating art, so the Marinellis have faith that the timeless nature of their work will help them survive.
La campana in sé per sé è quell'oggetto che ci fa compagnia, alcuni suoni perché li fa momenti lieti e purtroppo momenti tristi. La campana ha sempre dato un senso alla vita dell'uomo.
Glassblowers have been creating works of art on this small Venetian island for more than 700 years. Today, the very thing that powers Murano's industry could kill it. Gas prices are skyrocketing, and many furnaces have been forced to shut down.
Se le cose continuano così, di sicuro non si può andare avanti.
Chiara Taraglio runs one of the only women-owned workshops on the island. In February, she spent the inheritance from her mother's death to keep her business going.
Per tenere dei lavori per quando poi il prezzo si eventualmente riabbasserà, altrimenti dovremmo prendere una scelta e vedere cosa fare.
And it all comes at a time when the trade is already struggling.
Se oggi non abbiamo giovani, dobbiamo ringraziare qualche vecchio maestro che ha voluto partire con i propri segreti, ha fatto un danno all'isola e basta, e i giovani allo stesso tempo.
So amid a gas crisis and with a dwindling workforce, how is this industry still standing? Chiara and her partner Mariano Liboni launched their business in September 2021, just weeks before gas prices in Europe spiked. They're waiting to find out whether the government relief program will reimburse them for 3 months of gas bills.
Tutto ciò che è soffiato in questo tipo di lavorazione parte da una bolla.
They like to bring a feminine spin to their pieces, like this vase.
Abbiamo voluto unire quel tocco un po' più divertente e moderno, aggiungendo delle piccole tette qua e là.
Today, they're making a prehistoric Venus statue. Chiara builds up molten glass at the end of the rod. Any excess glass drips into a pan, called a farasa.
Questo liquido fluido che è quasi come miele tende a seguire la gravità.
Between trips to the furnace, she shapes the glass.
Quando giri velocemente un pezzo, puoi aprirlo più facilmente e la forma diventa dritta.
Chiara grew up in Italy, but learned American glassblowing techniques while working in Seattle.
Quindi in realtà qua è molto più difficile lavorare il vetro.
Harder because they need to work faster, especially when running the furnaces is so expensive. and they still need to pay attention to every detail.
C'è sempre il rischio di rottura in diciamo qualunque momento, quindi è un lavoro abbastanza rischioso.
They spend a lot of time standing in front of the 2,000-degree oven.
È come quando riscaldi i marshmallows davanti al fuoco, gli amici.
The gas furnace is what links this tiny business to the global economy. That's because Europe imports about 40% of its natural gas from Russia, which has been limiting the supply. Gas prices have already gone up after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And people here worry it could get worse. Back in November, the Veneto region set aside 3 million euros to help offset glassmakers' expenses. But it wasn't enough to keep some glassblowers from shutting down their furnaces. Gas became a crucial part of the industry in the 1950s. But the history goes back much further. The craft took off in Murano back in 1291, when Venetian officials ordered all glassblowers to relocate to the small island, to prevent the risk of fire on the mainland. Murano's reign over the industry peaked around the 15th century with the invention of transparent glass. But many glassmakers moved abroad in the 1630s when the plague triggered a financial crisis. Some masters kept the art alive by reviving traditional techniques during the 1800s. Another artist, Giancarlo Signoretto, started working in glass as a kid by making this horse statue for tourists.
Ogni cavallino è una storia a sé. Anche se ne faccio 50, tutti quanti non avranno un movimento differente.
He's trying to pass the torch by teaching his assistant Agnese.
Io sono del parere che insegnare e lasciare qualcosa è un valore aggiunto di un maestro. Tenere i propri segreti e non volerne parlare vuol dire che forse non abbiamo capito tanto della vita.
He remembers a time when masters were possessive of their methods, and he says that tainted today's industry.
Abbiamo ereditato sicuramente un mestiere favoloso, ma abbiamo anche ereditato la gelosia e l'ignoranza.
Now, Giancarlo faces the same crisis as the rest of the island. His last gas bill was 4 times higher than usual, and using less gas isn't really an option. These furnaces have to run 24/7.
Ma con un forno che noi non possiamo spegnerlo perché è sempre acceso.
If the temperature drops below 1,000 degrees Celsius, the crucibles inside that hold the molten glass will crack and break.
Praticamente cosa succede? Bisogna chiudere tutto il forno.
Rebuilding and reheating the furnace could take weeks and cost up to $22,000.
La fornace, come tanti pensano che non ci sono spese, invece è un giocattolo che costa tanto e se non lo sai usare ti freghi tutti quanti i tuoi benefici, tutti quanti i tuoi quattrini che hai messo via.
Giancarlo says he's still breaking even right now, and he doesn't want to lose customers by shutting down.
Ma è una storia che ci portiamo dentro, perciò la cosa più importante è garantire e rassicurare di chi è passato prima di te, non gli fargli fare brutta figura.
Mariana and Chiara are still debating whether or not to shut off their furnace. But even if they do, it won't stop them from innovating.
Caffè delle vetraie ribelli.
And no matter what, they refuse to give up on glass.
A me ha fatto molto bene e continua a farlo giorno per giorno e mi dà vita e mi fa rinascere ogni volta.
Giancarlo's same passion for the art will keep him going too.
C'è l'amore, perché lavorare il vetro bisogna essere innamorati del vetro. Se sappiamo farlo bene, io sono convinto che Murano non morirà mai.
It takes hours and at least 3 people to set up this loom properly. These long strings of wool form the base of a blanket that's called lichnik. It's made from sheep's wool by the Hutsul people, an ethnic minority in Ukraine that's been weaving for more than a century. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine goes on, Natalia Kishuk feels that weaving today is more important than ever.
Процесу. І не привикли українці так якби просто покоритися і здатися в будь-якій ситуації.
We went to Yavoriv in western Ukraine 2 days before the Russian invasion to see how these woolen blankets are woven and how this traditional craft is still standing. These are Carpathian sheep, a local breed that's been raised by the Hutsul people for more than 700 years.
То вони знають, що їм несуть доброго щось.
Shearing time comes once a year when the weather gets warmer. It takes wool from 3 sheep to make 1 blanket. Natalia washes the raw wool in boiling water before rinsing it in cold water. She then hangs it outside to get cleaned again by the rain. All this is to remove the strong smell and make the yarn whiter.
Тепле літо, коли тепла погода, сушиться, сонце знов таки відбілює, знов роса, дощ її мочать, сушать, воно так сушиться не за день, за два, це тиждень, другий.
Natalia and her husband Yaroslav were both born into weaving families. Today, they run the business with their children.
Наталі є художній хист, ми більш такі практичні, ми якби стараємось поєднати ото.
Yaroslav uses this wooden comb with metal teeth to untangle the wool. Natalia dyes some of the wool before transforming it into yarn using a wooden spindle. This process takes time, so Natalia plans her next patterns and designs while she spins.
Під цю роботу дуже файно щось собі думати і складати пісні. Навіть у нас такі переважно гуцульські традиційні пісні, такі, що як коломейки, то народжуються під час роботи. Тобто
These songs have been passed down from one generation to the next. Natalia's 15-year-old daughter, Yulia, still sings them today. She started to weave at the age of 3.
Ліжникарство в цій справі в моїй родині. І я повинна продовжувати.
She says singing while weaving brings her peace of mind. Natalia inherited this old loom from her grandfather, who built it more than 7 decades ago. Together with her husband and daughter, they add the thread. It's used as a base for the blanket, and it shouldn't be too thin or too thick, otherwise it can break during weaving. It's an important step that takes expertise and patience.
Уже рівно, правда?
Natalia then adds the yarn in between the threads. A simple pattern takes 7 to 8 hours to weave. The more complicated ones take 2 to 3 days. In the past, the Hutsul wove basic black, gray, and white blankets for their own use. But in the 1920s, artist Paraska Karol Shkribliak introduced more colors to the designs and passed the craft to others in the village and to Natalia's grandmother.
Бабуся сідала прясти нитку до кужеля, і я з бабусею разом теж, бо цікаво було. Не було нічим іншим бавитися у цьому той момент, бо це була забавка, це була і розвага, скоріш за все, ніж навчання.
Natalia's mother was a mathematician and her father was a physicist. Her mother made blankets as a hobby, but weaving wasn't profitable, so she wanted a different life for her daughter. But Natalia's passion for weaving always pulled her back to it, and she found a way to make money by selling it online. Today, these blankets are the main source of income for the family. Hutsul patterns feature diamonds, lines, and curves, and every shape means something.
Це як сонце, це як такі, як багатість, родючість, добро має бути це.
The Hutsul people have held on to their dialect and beliefs for hundreds of years. They're an ethnic group, believed to have settled in the Ivano-Frankivsk region in western Ukraine in the 13th and 14th centuries. The region has defended itself against the Mongol and Tatar invasions in the 13th century, and then from Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Imperial Russia in the 18th century. And now, as Ukraine lives through an invasion from Putin's Russia, they're resolved to defend their home as strongly as ever.
Якби ми ні у кого нічого не відбираємо, то теж ніхто не хочуть українці, щоб їх наганяли і забирали землю.
So far, this part of western Ukraine has not seen fighting, and staying in their village is necessary for patriotic and practical reasons. They need the machines, the natural resources, and the community to keep their business going. There are 20 families that still work in weaving in this Hutzul village of 2,000 people.
І самі такі узори. Ми тут привикли, що ми так, наприклад, щось робимо щось, вовни не стало, то я, наприклад, до тітки своєї, чи звернуся, запитаю, чи там той кольор нема, чи щось ми можемо один другого обмінятися, позичити, порадити один другому, і таке теж буває.
Natalia carries her blankets over this narrow bridge to a nearby volulo, a river-powered wooden device that spins with the flow of the water. It acts as a natural washing machine. A flood in 2008 destroyed 3 out of the 5 machines that were used. Today, there are only 2 left in their village. Cleaning the woven blankets is physically demanding, but it's essential to get rid of any lingering sheep smell. Depending on the water temperature and the type of wool, the blanket is left in the water for 6 to 10 hours. Time is sensitive. If the blanket stays for too long, it can shrink and lose its shape and look.
Треба йти і дивитися, що там робиться, чи якщо багато води, навіть може і поплисти в річці.
Washing the wool shrinks it down by 30 to 40 centimeters, something they take into account when planning the shape of the blanket. It also makes it thicker and tighter, so it can last for years.
Якби ми не робили, що би ми не витикали, який би ми не робили узор, файний узор має збитися, так збитися, як збивається, має збитися, тоді воно вже буде якісне, буде таке, як на роки.
When the washing is done, the blankets are put in this spinning machine to get rid of the water. They then hang them outside to dry for a few days.
Файно, і вітер, природа нам допомагає.
Yaroslav combs the blanket to make them feel softer, a practice that was not very common in the past and only started in the early 70s.
Ну, якби порівняти тепер, змінилось ці вже останні роки. З одної сторони ми начісуємо, з другої сторони начісуємо. Це є 2 в 1. Хто хоче на підлогу, той не начісує.
The blankets were traditionally given as a wedding present, and were even used as currency to barter for materials and animals. Today, they're in demand as works of art, and the craft continues to evolve.
Ну, видите, відколи оця система, кажуть, всесвітня мережа інтернет, клієнти є з усього світу. Я не знаю, навіть і сказати, де ще клієнти не були.
Their blankets sell for anywhere from $150 to $450. Special orders can cost more. It all depends on the colors used and the level of detail. Few among the younger generation are drawn to this labor-intensive craft, leaving the Hutzul community with only a handful of craftspeople. But Natalia and Yaroslav are passing it on to their children.
От, і це як-не-як, якщо в дитинстві навчитися робити певне ремесло, навчитися ткати, то воно не забудеться, аби через що би ти робив, чи ти би робив, чи ти би не робив в якийсь час. Це так, як передається у крові, ці навички ці будуть.
Egyptians in Luxor have been carving stones for thousands of years. And for Sayed Mahmoud al-Matani, sculpting is a way to tell his country's history through art. He inherited the craft from his father and grandfather, and has been doing it for over 6 decades.
يعني احنا عندنا ثروة قومية ويجب الحفاظ عليها لأن مصر مليئة بالخيرات وإذا استغلناها استغلال حقيقي صح.
In the past, craftsmen carved hieroglyphics and intricate figures of people, animals, and gods. They used stone to make everyday items, but also the tombs of their kings and queens. Today, artisans mostly make souvenirs and ornaments, like vases and jewelry boxes. But political turmoil in Egypt and the pandemic impacted Sayed's business, and tourism, his biggest source of income, virtually disappeared for 2 years. We went to Luxor to see how, despite hardship, this ancient craft is still standing. At 75, Sayed prefers to take on complex tasks, like carving details into miniature pieces.
بعمل حاجة أروح المقابر أشوفها زيها ولا مش زيها لغاية وقتنا هذا.
He's eager to pass on the craft to younger generations, and so he trains apprentices like Ahmad, who's been doing this job with him for 13 years. First, they cut the block of stone with a saw. Then Ahmad breaks it with a hammer to get it to the size he wants to work with. If he's working with a large piece, like a vase, he places it in a hole in the ground that keeps it in place.
وهو الصناعة دي متوارثة. شفنا الصناعة بتاعتهم على الحيطان مكتوبة عملوها كده برضه.
He switches to a hand-powered drill to hollow a core for the vase. It can take him up to 5 days to do this step alone.
بكون ده طبق فأنا بركحت له حفرة بتمسكها زي حجام. بعد كده بنحط عليها شوية تراب زي كده ونعملها عملية تفريغ من الداخل بالآلات اليدوية زي كده.
Egyptians have been carving stone since the earliest dynasties 5,000 years ago. Almost all of the stone-built tombs can be found west of the Nile River, in the burial site called the Valley of the Kings. Pharaohs commissioned vast statues that were meant to glorify them in life and death, and skilled craftsmen quarried the deserts to build them. It took years to finish constructing and carving these ancient monuments, but as new materials emerged, the use of stone dwindled. Even though modern tools are available today, Sayed prefers the simple carving methods similar to those his ancestors used.
هو اللي يشتغل بالمواد الكهربائية ما يطلعش حاجة صح. لازم الهاند ميد. الفراعنة أن استعملوا الحاجة بدون ميكنة فطلع مظبوطة، لكن احنا ما نجيب مواتير ودي يخرم دي وده لا ما ينفعش.
Once the center is done, Ahmad uses a file to even out the surface.
في نوعين مبارد أو ثلاثة، في مبرد اللي هو زي كده الشكل دي برضه الشفة بتاعت الحتة بنحددها. بعد ما تنتهي المبرد تكون شكلت في نوع شنفرة تدينا طبقة أنعم.
He then sands the vase with a softer sander to do the finish. Finally, he cleans it with water. Making one vase like this takes Ahmad 10 days. Larger items can take months to finish. These pieces sell anywhere from $300 to $1,000. Sayed devoted his life to a craft that he inherited. But his real interest began as a kid, when he stumbled upon ancient carvings while playing with his friends.
كنا نطلع من المدارس ونروح نلعب كورة في المقابر في المعابد يعني كانش يعني ما كانش في حاجة. فازاي وصلوا كده؟ ازاي عملوا كده؟ ازاي وصلوا كده؟ فأنا بدأت يعني زرعت في دماغي.
He's mastered hieroglyphics by carving them into figurines and vases, and he often refers to books to match the original inscriptions.
يعني احنا بنستعين ببعض المجلدات عشان نعرف نشتغلها صح. يعني انت عشان تعمل ده صح لابد. شفت ازاي؟ اهو. شوف.
Sayed works with different types of stones, like the Egyptian alabaster, granite, and basalt. Some of them go through a burning process to harden the pieces. And it's all done outside. Sayed uses cow dung to create the perfect ground for stone burning. Larger ones can stay in the fire for at least 24 hours. More than half the people in Luxor work in the tourism industry. And most of Sayed's customers are tourists who are often looking for vases and sculptures depicting Egyptian gods. But the 2011 Egyptian revolution and protests kept foreign visitors away. And then the pandemic made things even worse.
بس يعني فيش أجانب بيجوا كتير يعني أنا كان ما يمرش عليه يومين ويجيني أجانب يوم تاني يجيني ناس أجانب من ألمانيا من أمريكا يعني بيجوا من كل حتة.
Sayed also works as a farmer to make ends meet, but his passion is stone carving.
أنا بفخر بأي حاجة أعملها بس نكون عملتها على صح. هتجيب مادة إيه؟ مش مشكلتي. مش هتجيب مادة مش مشكلتي. بس أنا أهم حاجة أعمل الصح.
Working in a craft that has lasted thousands of years, he knows the hard times will pass. So he's determined to pass on his skills to the next generation.
لا مش هتندثر إن شاء الله لا لا لا. في شباب طالعين كويسين يعني. بس عاوزين محاباة شوية كده يرعوا لهم يعني. يعني.
At the center of Morocco's ancient city of Fez sits a piece of history. The Shuwara leather tannery is the oldest in the world. Amid a multitude of colors and powerful odors, tanners here transform animal hides into leather. And their methods date back to the 11th century. But the work is incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive.
راه جيت معاه راه كتلقى هاد الخانق اكثر من داك اللي كيدير التراكسيون.
Adil Al-Karisi has been doing this job for over 30 years. But the tanning process that he loves relies on heavy chemicals that pose health hazards to him and his coworkers.
النص تما ديال الدباغه راه في التالي ديالو راه مرض، راه حاله لا يرثى بها.
And some say they're no longer willing to take the risk. So will this ancient craft continue to stand the test of time? We visited Morocco to find out how after more than 1,000 years, this craft is still standing. These arches surrounding Fez lead to its market's narrow paths. To find the tannery, all you have to do is follow your nose. The scent of dead animal skin and feces fills the air at the souk, a leather bazaar that houses the 3 biggest leather tanneries in the city.
دار الدباغ كانت سميتها دار الذهب. تبارك الله كانت شي حاجه يعني ماشي هو الفلوس، واحد السعاده كنت كتحس بها، واحد الفرحه كنت كنحس بها بقلبي، هذاك الشيء تبارك الله ما كيتوصفش.
For most, the smell is unbearable. Local guides give tourists sprigs of mint to place under their nose when they visit. But for Adil, it's part of the tradition. He works with goat and sheep skins that he buys from a nearby market, and then starts the cleaning process.
دابا هذه المرحله الاولى كنسميوها النقاع. هذا هو النقاع اللي باش كتطلق منها هذه الملحه هذه كنشلوها، من بعد ما نشلوها ان شاء الله بحول الله كتبات 24 ساعه.
Adil uses water to loosen any dirt or mud. It also softens the skin, making it easier to work with later. The next day, he transfers the hides to these large stone vats that hold natural acids and dyes. He leaves the skin for 2 to 3 days in a solution made of chemicals, salt water, and cow urine. It'll break down excess fat, leftover flesh, and hair. But it's just as harsh on human skin and can cause serious injury.
علاش هاد الماده صعيبه بزاف على حسب هاد الماده اللي فيها ديال الفازا. راه ملي كطول هكايا راه كتخليك ديما لاطراس. كنوريك لاطراس اللي في يديا راه الكويات هما هادو فينا راه. يعني هاد الكويات هادو راه تقريبا عندهم 20 عام وما بغاوش يبراو.
Adil's father, who also worked in the tanneries, tried to stop him from following the same path.
من هبط لي لدار الدباغ بعد النهار الاول دوزها عليا زعما باش كما الله نقنط ونمشي بحالاتي. والو ما بغيتش، ما عجبتني بزاف، ارتحيت فيها بزاف.
Adil stands in the mixture for hours a day, plucking and scraping off any loose hair with his bare hands. He wears waterproof pants, but there's still a risk of severe chemical burns. Then he washes the hide 3 times until all the hair falls off.
بعد ما كيدوز واحد 48 ساعه كندوه للفونو كيتصبن. هاد الماكينه كنعطيوها حنا الفونو هي اللي كتصبن لك السلعه كطير داك الجيل.
This tanning technique dates back to the 11th century. The natural chemicals in the solution alter the protein structure of the hide.
الدباغه نباتيه ما كايناش، ما كانش في شي بلاصه واحده اخرى الا هذا المنتوج هذا دابا ما كيضرش. يعني واخا غادي نديروه تبطين هذا كيشرب العرق، ما كيديرش لا كزيمه لا حساسيه لا والو، ماده طبيعيه نباتيه.
Adil then moves the hides to the basin filled with a mixture of pigeon droppings and water. They sit for 2 days to thin and stretch. Then he places them back into the phono machine for a final wash and drapes them along small balconies to dry for 48 hours. Traditional tanneries like this were common in Fez and Marrakesh. In the 16th century, workers used leather to make products like books, shoes, and clothes. It quickly became one of the country's leading exports. But tanneries during this time used extremely hazardous chemicals, and many workers suffered from severe health conditions like cancer. So in the 19th century, the leather-making industry shifted away from traditional, dangerous practices to more modern machines. The few traditional tanneries that survived struggled to compete.
دار الدباغ دابا بليان خرجوا 200 هذا كيخرج 800 في الفونو.
Today, Adil makes less than half the money he made when he started out. Despite that, he says he can't see himself doing anything else. In this small room, he scrapes the hides to remove any leftover hairs or fibers. This step has caused him severe pain and has taken a toll on his body over the years.
الحاجة الوحيدة اللي كنتعرضوا لها هنايا كنتعرضوا شوية ديال البرد. كيأثر علينا داك البرد في الظهر ديالنا. لأن كتعرف شحال نتايا حاني كتحني على 60 كتبقى 60 وانت داير هكا 60 مرة كتطلع وتهبط. وكل جلدة كنضربوا فيها 64 ضربة. 64 ضربة ديال طلعة وهبطة كل وحدة. تصور 60 شحال كتضرب.
He continues until the hide is completely smooth. When it's ready, he brings the finished leather to craftsmen like Mohammed Al-Helou.
السلام عليكم. اسم محمد. كيداير اخا كاين مع السمارة مزيان.
Mohammed has worked as a leather craftsman for over 20 years. He separates the leather based on the type of skin and checks the quality to determine what product he can make from it.
هذوك الجليدات خديت هاد البيعة ولكن جبتها شتها مع الإنارة مزيانة هكا جبرتها يعني خدامة كاين فيها ما يصلح فيها ما يتخدم فيها ما يمشي.
Mohammed designs bags, shoes, and belts. These handcrafted pieces can take up to a week to make.
حتى خصنا شي واحد بحال هكا تا هو خاصو يعرف المنتج شنو كيشري. شمن مراحل داز. راه شحال المراحل دازو منها راه داز باش تكون هذا الصاك هذا والانسان اللي يحمل شي حاجه راه كيحمل شي حاجه ديال الثقافه راه كيحمل شي حاجه شي تقريبا على نقولوا 10 ديال القرون هاد الدار دابا.
More than half the population in Fez works in crafts and merchandise, making souvenirs and products and selling them to tourists. But the pandemic brought tourism to a halt for 2 years, and the economy hasn't fully recovered since.
مزيان. كيدوز نهارك ولدي. هذا هو دوك الناس المعجبين مقوار كيدوزو مقدامين كتعجبهم الصنعه ديالي كيقول واش مسموح نتصور معاك كيدخلوا كيتصوروا معايا.
Adil knows how difficult this craft is, but he doesn't believe traditional tanning should end. Instead, he hopes conditions will improve for the next generation of tanners.
الحاجه اللي كتخليني شاد في هذه الخدمه هو الصبر. عندي شي احساس سبحان الله العظيم كيدور كيقول دابا الامور تبدل ديما تابع بحال شي خيال تابعه.
One sheet of traditional Vietnamese zai paper can last 800 years. But the craft of hand-making it is dying out. Only a few families in Bắc Ninh province continue to transform bark into paper. The process can take weeks, sometimes months. Phan Văn Tum runs one of the last workshops in his village.
Cho đến giờ phút này thì anh cũng chưa nghĩ đến làm cái gì khác cả.
As far back as the 13th century, this paper was widely used for printing historical records and making folk art. But industrialized paper mills have brought this craft to the brink of extinction. So how is this centuries-old craft still standing? The two trees that make the sisal paper can be found in the forests of northern Vietnam. Workers harvest the bark between August and October, when it peels easily because of the heat. Tum is one of the last traditional sisal paper makers in Dung Lo. He's been working in one of the last handicraft villages for 40 years. Today, he employs a small group of people. They soak the bark and cut it into 2-foot-long pieces and separate the good kind from the bad. Grinding is one of the few steps that is done by a machine.
Ngày xưa các cụ toàn giã bằng tay chứ không có máy nghiền như bây giờ.
But it still requires some physical effort. Tam pushes the bark with an oat stick to help it move through the grinder until it turns into a fine pulp. Sap from strips of wood from the maw tree will make the glue for the paper. Soaking it in water helps release it. Tum was 20 years old when he started making sisal paper. He learned the trade from his father and takes pride in keeping traditional techniques alive.
Tức là giấy thủ công của mình làm thì nó sẽ để được lâu năm hơn là giấy máy.
Even the tools they use are handmade. Wenkong Wang is the last sieve maker in Zungo, who still makes the wooden frames that shape the paper from scratch.
Nếu chú làm thợ mộc thì là khoảng hơn 40 năm rồi. Còn như chú làm khuôn này thì là từ 30 năm trước.
His frames can last up to 3 years and are essential to getting the paper just right. If the dimensions are even slightly off, the paper could be ruined.
Thì khi xeo là cái lề này là những cái lề hay là những cái gió này là rất nhỏ, nó mới lọt ra cái chỗ đấy là cái tờ giấy nó rất bẩn.
Wen Thi Do begins forming the paper. She's been doing this job since she was 12, and her years of experience make her one of the best workers here.
Cái này chị làm cũng lâu ghê rồi. 33 năm.
She dunks the frame into the pulp mixture and sifts it until a perfect layer forms on top. It may look simple, but it's a skill that requires years of training.
Mà bỏ ra ngoài đây mà nó bị sót như thế này, ví dụ như thành vào tờ thì nó sẽ rúm thì cái tờ đấy mình lại phải bỏ đi.
She uses a bamboo screen to separate the paper. It is also made by hand. Do Zui Thai has been crafting these intricate folding screens for over 40 years. He's a 6th-generation bamboo maker and only sells to local artisans. Duo is so fast and precise, she can make 1,300 sheets in one day. She brings the stacks over to the press. It slowly squeezes the excess water from the paper. Tum has been using the press since he opened his workshop in 1982. He peels and sticks the sheets onto a wall one by one and coats them with an extra layer of maw sap.
Cái nhựa này có tác dụng là, tức là để nó tách từng tờ giấy một ra. Sau khi mình múc thành tờ giấy.
They stay on the wall for a week until they're completely dry. Paper making was the heart of the economy in Zungo for centuries. People used sisal paper to make books and dungo paintings, a popular folk art used to decorate homes during the Vietnamese New Year. But demand dwindled when paper factories opened in the area in the early 90s. By 2020, 75% of Vietnam's paper was factory made.
Thì sau đó cả làng luôn, hàng bao nhiêu trăm hộ để vẫn làm cái giấy này thì là bị mất nghề. Mất nghề đấy sau đó người ta mới đưa vào làm máy.
Today, Tum mostly sells the paper to museums and national archives. Although he's kept the craft alive in his community, he still worries that it may end with him. Younger people haven't shown interest in preserving it.
Con nhà tôi nó cũng tìm việc khác nó làm rồi, mà nó cũng làm được cái việc khác rồi, cho nên là cái nghề giấy này nó bị vất vả quá, thì đâm ra là chúng nó cũng không muốn theo.
But Chan Hang Yoon is trying to change that. She founded the ZA Project in 2013, a non-profit focused on preserving traditional papermaking in Vietnam.
When you touch the handmade paper, it's a very different feeling when you touch it, and when you use it, you know the material is come from nature.
The organization buys and uses Tum's sisal paper to produce postcards, jewelry, and artwork. The proceeds help support artisans who are working to keep sisal paper alive in their community. Yoon is also working to teach more young people and encourage them to use the paper.
We combine between the traditional value and also like contemporary and modern designs for young people. They are more interested in this craft.
In the last 9 years, the ZA project has reached dozens of young artisans across Vietnam. It also restored a sense of pride in traditional paper makers.
Vừa vất vả mà vừa phải có tay nghề, vừa phải có sức khỏe, nó nhiều thứ lắm.
For this community of paper makers, this craft has become a labor of love.
Bởi vì tôi cũng yêu nghề, cho nên là tôi mới làm được lâu năm như thế. Nếu như cái nghề này của anh mà bị mai một đi thì rất là tiếc lắm.
Papermaking has been the heart of this Indian town's economy for at least 5 centuries. And a lot of the work is done by hand, one sheet at a time. This factory can make 10,000 sheets in just a day. But in a modern world full of automated paper mills, how is a 500-year-old industry still standing? The work at Kalpana Handmade Papers in Sanganer starts with waste. The workshop recycles scraps from garment factories that would otherwise be thrown away. Nimi Chand Saini is the owner and oversees every step of the process.
इसमें जो दिख रहा है आपको ये छलनी है, इसमें कोई मिट्टी के कण हो या इसमें कोई कचरा हो तो कचरा हम निकाल रहे हैं इससे.
Bigger pieces go through this shredding machine. Within seconds, a pile of pulverized fabric comes out the other end. Workers dump over 200 pounds of shredded fabric and paper into this tank. One batch takes 1,500 liters of water. The mixing used to be done entirely by hand, which took triple the amount of time as it does today. Now, the machine can churn out pulp in under 2 hours. Then, it's time for the most crucial step, turning the pulp into paper. This skill requires years of training.
इसी का जो सबसे मेन ये चीज़ सीखे हुए कारीगर होते हैं, उनको सिखाया जाता है. सिखाने के बाद में ही कर पाते हैं ये. नहीं ये जो है बिल्कुल इनको हर आदमी के लिए मुश्किल है.
It takes 2 people to spread the pulp evenly onto the sieve. The amount varies depending on how thick the paper will be.
सबसे बड़ा मुश्किल काम यही है, इसको जो बिल्कुल अपने स्ट्रेट रखना. ये पर शीट वेट के हिसाब से होती है, तो इस पल्प के नाप से ये डाल रहे हैं अकॉर्डिंग उसके कि जितनी थिकनेस हमको चाहिए.
A piece of cloth goes on top of the pulp so that the sheets don't stick together. For specialty paper, workers add extra decorations, like these rose petals. They do this 1,000 times until the batch is complete. Then, the stack goes into the hydraulic press.
पहले सर इस पे क्या होता था कि हम इसके ऊपर कुछ लकड़ी का फंटा लगा करके इस पे कुछ वेट रख करके और उस फिर पानी निकालने के बाद में फिर क्या होता था कि इसको हम दीवारों को चिपका के पेपर को.
Now they use heavy machinery to press the stack and send it to the upper level where there's sunlight. They remove each piece of cloth one by one, so it can be reused in another batch.
ये फट करके खराब नहीं हो जाएगा, तब तक हम इसको यूज करते रहेंगे.
The sheets hang out to dry for 2 days. Then a machine called a calendar smooths out each piece.
ये चद्दर है लोहे की, इसके बीच में ये दोनों रोल के बीच में जाएगा मशीन में.
Workers say that the paper's texture changes drastically after this process. Finally, with the help of a giant paper cutter, the worker slices stacks of paper down to size. The scraps will make their way back into the process from the beginning. Paper-making communities called Kagsis came to India around the 16th century and eventually settled in the town of Sanganer. A nearby river made it the perfect place for making paper. But when the British came to power in the 1800s, they started importing paper from mills abroad. The local workshops that made paper by hand couldn't compete, and many closed down. Mahatma Gandhi stepped in during the 1940s during his fight for Indian independence. He advocated for local handicrafts and is credited today with saving the handmade paper industry. Even though this factory's process has modernized with some machines, the sheet-by-sheet technique sets it apart from most mass-produced paper.
हाथ से जो बनाया वो पेपर है, उसमें एक अलग लुकिंग, अलग उसकी जो एक डिज़ाइन उस पेपर की एक अलग ही देखने को मिलती है, जो कि मिल मेड से अलग हट करके है.
They ship all over the world and use the paper to make hundreds of different products. About 40 employees design things like calendars, jewelry boxes,
तो आप इस बॉक्स को जैसे देखेंगे तो इसमें जो बाहर हम कार्डबोर्ड यूज़ कर रहे हैं वो दैट इज़ अ रिसाइकल्ड कार्डबोर्ड, और अंदर जो आप पेपर देख रहे हैं इट इज़ अ हैंडमेड पेपर.
and ornaments.
क्रिसमस ट्री पे जैसे डेकोरेट करें तो ये पूरा इको फ्रेंडली प्रोडक्ट है.
The workers here take pride in their craft.
सबसे बड़ी बात यह है कि एक ये वेस्ट चीज़ से हम इस पेपर को तैयार कर रहे हैं. कोई बहुत हमको गर्व महसूस होता है कि हम अपने हाथ से जो है कि एक हाथ की कोई चीज़ बना करके और हम उसको मार्केट में उतार रहे हैं.
And as long as people need paper, Nimi is confident his business will thrive.
हैंडमेड पेपर की जो हाथ से बनाई हुई चीज़ है और इसकी लुकिंग जो है वो एक अलग पहचान है. इस वजह से इसको रखना चाहते हैं. इसकी डिमांड है मार्केट में. इसका बहुत ही अच्छा ब्राइट फ्यूचर है. ये एक हर आदमी की यूज़ की एक चीज़ है.
Soy sauce is one of the most important ingredients in Japanese cuisine. Yet only 1% of the country's supply is made through the traditional method of barrel aging. That's because it can take 4 years for one batch to go from barrel to bottle. Yasuo Yamamoto is a 5th-generation soy sauce maker, and one of the only brewers in the country who hand builds his own barrels.
木桶で作るとうまいんですよ。
Most fermented seasonings in Japan used to be made this way, but industrialization replaced almost all the country's wooden barrels with steel. Today, the average soy sauce is made through a shorter, chemicalized process. So what does it take to make authentic soy sauce? And how is this centuries-old method still standing? What makes the soy sauce special is the wooden barrel, called kioke. One can last for over a century. Yasuo makes bamboo strips to wrap around the barrel because the saltiness of the soy sauce can corrode metal.
こういう竹だと塩分にも強いので100年持ちます。
It takes at least 3 people to assemble one barrel. But not many do this anymore. After modern machinery took over the market, almost all kioke makers in Japan went out of business. So Yasuo learned to make his own.
ここから今からきれいにします。きれいにお化粧する感じですね。
Before these barrels are put to use, crushed wheat and steamed soybeans are mixed with koji, the fungus that will kickstart the fermentation process. This giant vat regulates temperature so the fungus can grow. After 2 days, the mixture goes to the Moromi house. This is where the wooden barrels help create the breeding ground for the bacteria.
お醤油を発酵させる菌の住処になるんですよ。
Over 1 ton of the soybean mixture fills each barrel, along with salt water. While Yasuo and his team stir, the soybeans bump up against each other and create tiny tears so that other bacteria can get in and start to break them down. The workers pump air into the barrel to make the aerobic yeast more active. Even though Yasuo says the microbes do most of the work, his part of the job is still demanding.
大変体力的にきついです。一番大変だった時は2ヶ月で9キロ痩せました。これ大変やなと思ってもおもろいなと思うと。
He checks on the soybeans every day to see if they need mixing. And based on their scent and appearance, he can tell where they are in the process.
私の経験上うちの場合最初リンゴの香りがするんですよ。その次にバナナの香りがする。
The soybeans will ferment here for at least a year and a half. Yasuo has 87 barrels in different phases. He believes a good barrel is one that will outlive him.
こういう この桶で、だいたい今150年ぐらい使ってます。
These types of barrels have been in production in Japan since at least the 17th century. But everything changed during World War II, when materials became more scarce and expensive in Japan. The government knew its people couldn't live without their staple seasoning. So they ordered factories to make production cheaper and faster, cutting the process from years to months. So while many brewers expanded and modernized, small businesses like Yasuo's families could barely keep up.
なのでうちはタンクも買えない近代化の工場に出資できないお金がないので。
Yasuo stepped in 2003, just before his father suddenly became sick and had to retire. So he had to take over and pull a struggling business out of debt. He also had to teach himself a lot of the process, like how to use the press. After a year and a half of fermentation, Yasuo pipes the soybean mixture into this machine. He layers on a piece of traditional wrapping cloth. Then the machine slowly squeezes out the soy sauce over 10 days.
で最初は自分の重さで自然に醤油が垂れてくる。で毎日少しずつ重ねていくとまた上の重さが加わるのでじわっと絞れてきて。
Some industrial factories press it all at once, but Yasuo says getting a quality product is all about patience. After this stage, some of the soy sauce goes back into the barrel with more soybeans and wheat for 2 more years to make Yasuo's main product, saishikomi, a darker, stronger tasting soy sauce. When the microbes have enough time to naturally ferment the soybeans, it gives the soy sauce a sweeter aftertaste. Some industrial brands mimic this by adding sweeteners.
でうちのお醤油の場合は、無添加で何も入ってないですけど、最初若干塩味がきますけど、あとじわーっとね塩味が消えて甘みになるんです。
That balanced umami flavor is what chefs like Hitoshi Kishimoto are after. He's been running his restaurant Koyomi in Shotoshima for 5 years. For almost every dish, he cooks with naturally fermented soy sauce, including Yasuo's brand.
その時の熱意っていうのが多分味にも反映してるなと思って、で今回はだいたい5種類のお醤油を使ってそのバランスを取ります。それを組み合わせることで一つのものができるというのがすごく面白い味付けになると思うので、この場合はとても大切にしています。日本人にとって醤油というのがとても身近で親しみやすい昔からの馴染みの味だということがなくなって回っては困るし。
In order for traditional soy sauce to continue, barrel production needs to keep up. That's why Yasuo holds barrel making workshops every year.
でうちで職人を育成する。で世界中の人たちの本物を味わってもらう。
He sells his authentic soy sauce to people all over the world. A bottle goes for $35 on Amazon, around triple the price of a commercial alternative.
でもやっぱり本当に美味しい記憶で作ったお醤油がゼロになるって本物がなくなることじゃないですか。
For Yasuo, passing down the legacy of barrel-aged soy sauce is part of his life's mission.
私駅伝だと思ってるんですよ。この蔵と桶とこの金の生態系と次の息子の代に渡すのが私の孫やひ孫が袴に行った時にあのじいさん何言い出したか桶作るって言ったから俺ら桶も作れるし醤油も作れるなって言ったら嬉しいでしょ。だからやるんですよ。
The secret to making this sacred mirror is known by just a handful of people. Aranmula Kanari is made entirely from metal, and the formula for the special reflective alloy has been passed down in this community in India for around 500 years. The process is incredibly labor-intensive and done entirely by hand. It's all to get a reflection that gives zero distortion, and the mirror is believed to bring good luck. Sudhamal Jay learned the trade secrets from her father when she was little, so when he died, she chose to defy cultural taboos and take on the business.
പിന്നെ ഏത് സ്ത്രീകൾക്കും ഇത് എത്ര ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുള്ള ജോലിയായാലും ചെയ്യാൻ സാധിക്കുമെന്നുള്ളതിൻ്റെ ഒരു തെളിവും കൂടിയാണ്.
She's carried the business through a devastating flood and the pandemic. So what makes this mirror so unique? And how is this centuries-old craft still standing? Ranmula Kannadi gets its name from its birthplace, a district in Kerala known for its rich culture, and for its temple, where the mirror was born. Originally, only royals and priests could use the mirror for rituals. Today it's more accessible, but the social and spiritual importance still remains, and so does the age-old process.
സാധാരണ ഗ്ലാസ് മിററും ആറന്മുള കണ്ണാടിയും തമ്മിലുള്ള വ്യത്യാസം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മൾ ആറന്മുള കണ്ണാടി ആദ്യം മുതലേ നമ്മൾ ഹാൻഡ് മെയ്ഡ് കൈകൊണ്ട് തന്നെയാണ് അതിൻ്റെ എല്ലാ വർക്കുകളും ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഒരു മെഷീനറിയും നമ്മൾ ഇവിടെ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നില്ല.
Sudhamal works with her son Niranjan, often into the night. They're melting down the raw metals that they'll need for tomorrow's batch of mirrors. An old roof tile makes the perfect mold. Niranjan seals the end of it so that the molten metal won't leak out. The mirror's alloy is made of tin and copper. They're melted down separately and poured into different molds. The next day, the tin and copper rods will be broken up and melted down together in the perfect ratio to create the mirror's reflective surface. Sudhamal starts the day by making the clay. It'll be used to build the mold for the mirror. She crushes up leftover pottery into a fine powder. Another ingredient is jute, a fiber they take from grocery bags. She mixes the jute and the pottery dust with mud that she harvested from a nearby paddy field. A little water loosens up the mixture, so she can knead it until it reaches the right consistency. Sudhamal is doing the kind of physical work that's typically done by men in this industry.
ആദ്യമായിട്ട് ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻ്റ് ആയിട്ട് ഈ തൊഴിൽ ചെയ്യുന്ന ആദ്യത്തെ ഒരു വനിതയാണെന്നുള്ളതിൽ എനിക്ക് അഭിമാനമുണ്ട്.
Her father became sick in 2007, and his dying wish was for someone to carry on his legacy. Since he had no sons, he left the secrets with his wife and daughter.
ഈ തൊഴിലിനെ മുന്നോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുപോകണം, നമ്മുടെ കുടുംബത്തെ ഒരു ജോലിയല്ലേ, അത് നിലനിർത്തിക്കൊണ്ട് പോകണം എന്ന് എല്ലാവരും സപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്തിട്ടേ ഉള്ളൂ.
Sudhamal's mother, Punamal, is in charge of packing the clay into circular molds. The discs dry outside anywhere from 1 to 4 days, depending on how sunny it is. Once they're dried and smoothed out, Sudhamal coats the discs with wet charcoal. The charcoal fills in the disc's tiny pores, so that the mirror will come out smoothed after it's sandwiched between the two discs. Niranjan puts tiny pieces of metal on one disc before placing the other one on top. This creates a space that the molten metal will later fill. He layers on more clay until the mold is completely sealed. Niranjan learned how to make mirrors from his grandfather when he was a kid. He came back to the craft after getting a business degree.
എൻ്റെ അപ്പൂപ്പൻ്റെ മരണശേഷമാണ് ഇതിൽ കൂടുതലും ശ്രദ്ധിക്കാൻ തുടങ്ങിയത്. അമ്മയെ സഹായിക്കാനും അപ്പോൾ കൂടുതൽ അതിനോടുള്ള ആഗ്രഹം വന്നു, അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്തു തുടങ്ങി.
This kind of passion for this work is not common for someone his age.
ആളുകൾ ഈ ക്രാഫ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ മടിക്കുന്നവരുമുണ്ട്. അത് ഇത് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള പാടും ചൂടത്തുള്ള നിർമ്മാണ രീതികളും ഒക്കെ ആയിരിക്കാം.
While the crucible dries out, Niranjan breaks up the tin and copper rods that he cast the day before. Only the people who have inherited this craft know just how much of each metal to add to the crucible.
ഈ നിർമ്മാണ മേഖലയിലുള്ള ഒരു സൊസൈറ്റി ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു നിയമം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് നമ്മൾ ഇതിൻ്റെ സീക്രട്ട് രഹസ്യങ്ങൾ, പ്രോസസ്സിൻ്റെ എല്ലാ രഹസ്യങ്ങളും അങ്ങനെ പുറത്ത് ആർക്കും പറഞ്ഞു കൊടുക്കാറില്ല. അതേ കുടുംബങ്ങളിലെ തന്നെ കുട്ടികൾക്ക് കൈമാറിയാണ് വരുന്നത്.
Legend has it that at least 300 years ago, the formula for reflective metal came to a village elder in a dream. Another story says that metalworkers accidentally discovered the alloy while making a crown for the king. The knowledge has been passed down in mirror-making families ever since. But that legacy almost came to an end for Sudhamal's family, when floods wiped out nearly their entire stock in 2018. It was the worst flooding the state of Kerala had seen in a century. Sudhamal and her family were among 1 million people who were forced to flee. After the floods, they came home to corroded tools and broken mirrors. totaling up to $17,000 worth of damage.
ആറന്മുള കണ്ണാടിയുമായിട്ട് ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട എല്ലാ നിർമ്മാണ എക്യുപ്മെൻറ്റ്സും എല്ലാം ലോസായി.
Not long after they got back to regular business, the pandemic hit. They didn't receive any orders for 8 months.
അതുപോലെ എല്ലാ യൂണിറ്റിനും സാമ്പത്തിക ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുകളുണ്ട് നന്നായിട്ട്.
Sudhamal and Naranjan can't afford to hire anyone right now, so they have to put in double the work. Much of their 10-hour workday is spent tending to the fire. Naranjan feeds it with charcoal and coconut husks, while Sudhamal cranks the fan.
ഏറ്റവും നമുക്ക് ആ ചൂട് ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുള്ള ചൂട് തന്നെയാണ്.
The crucibles sit in the 1200-degree fire for about an hour, with the metal pieces at the bottom. Then Naranjan checks to see if the metal is melted by listening carefully for a sound. He cools down the hot crucible with his bare hands and a little bit of wet clay. Then he slowly flips it. That makes the molten metal inside trickle down and fill the space between the discs.
അങ്ങനെ ഒരു പീസായിട്ടല്ല ഒരു എണ്ണമായിട്ടല്ല നമ്മൾ നിർമ്മിക്കാറുള്ളത്. ഒരു ബൾക്കായിട്ട് 10 പീസ് അല്ല 20 പീസൊക്കെ എടുത്തിട്ടാണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്.
To double check that it worked, he cracks open the top of each one. If there's a little metal left over, that means the mirror was successfully forged. But things don't always go according to plan. Sometimes the metal leaks out and doesn't form the mirror. But they always make sure to recycle leftover pieces back into the process. The next day, it's time for the reveal. The mirror isn't reflective just yet. It needs to go through several rounds of polishing. But first, Sudhamal cuts it down. The size will determine the price. These mirrors range anywhere from $20 to $1,300. Their most popular kind is a handheld mirror called Valkanadi. It's the same one that was used by royals. And today it's often gifted for housewarmings and weddings. The brass frame is made entirely by hand too, using a sand casting process. They make big batches of these frames a couple times a year. And the designs are all hand chiseled.
കൂടുതൽ 95% ഹാൻഡ് മെയ്ഡ് ചെയ്യാൻ തന്നെയാണ് ആഗ്രഹം. കൂടുതലും ആളുകൾ ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്നത് ഹാൻഡ് മെയ്ഡായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രൊഡക്ട്സാണ്. സോ മെഷീൻ യൂസുള്ള പ്രൊഡക്ട്സ് ആരും ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടാൻ താല്പര്യമില്ല എന്നാണ് എൻ്റെ വിശ്വാസം.
Sudhamal uses wet sandpaper to smooth the mirror's surface. She applies a few drops of coconut oil to polish it. And then she finally places the mirror inside the brass frame, using a homemade adhesive.
പിന്നെ പണ്ട് കാലം മുതലേ മണലും മെഴുകും ചെഞ്ചലും ഒരു പ്രത്യേക അനുഭവത്തിൽ ഉരുക്കിയെടുത്ത ആ മിശ്രിതത്തെ മണലുമായിട്ട് ചേർത്താണ് ഒരു അരക്കുണ്ടാക്കുകയും.
Sudhamal gives it a few more rounds of polishing with more coconut oil and a velvet cloth. They always put a sticker on the back of the frame to mark its authenticity. It's a crucial step, since counterfeit Aranmula Kannadis take up a huge part of the market. That's why the Indian government gave artisans exclusive rights to make these only in Aranmula back in 2005. And with a good eye, you can tell the difference between a real and a fake.
അതേപോലെ തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ പിന്നെ പ്രതിബിംബം യഥാർത്ഥ പ്രതിബിംബമാണ് അതിൽ കാണുന്നത്.
Typical glass mirrors reflect light through the back of the mirror, which can create distortion. And Aranmula Kannadi reflects light on the surface of the metal, so it's believed to show a more accurate reflection.
മിറർ അവസാനമായിട്ട് പോളിഷ് ചെയ്ത് നമ്മൾ എടുക്കുന്ന ഉടനെ അതിൽ നമ്മുടെ മുഖം നോക്കുമ്പോൾ അത് ഒരു സന്തോഷവും സംതൃപ്തിയുള്ള ഒരു വരുന്നതായിരുന്നു ഏറ്റവും ഇഷ്ടം.
And even though the traditional process is taxing, it's part of their ancestry.
മെഷീൻ യൂസ് ചെയ്ത് ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന ക്രാഫ്റ്റും ഹാൻഡ് മെയ്ഡായിട്ട് ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന ക്രാഫ്റ്റും തമ്മിൽ കുറേ വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ട്.
Sudhamal hopes the next wave of mirror makers will see that too.
പുതിയ തലമുറ അങ്ങനെ ഗിഫ്റ്റ് വാങ്ങിക്കാൻ താല്പര്യപ്പെടുന്നില്ല എന്ന് പറയുന്നെങ്കിലും എനിക്ക് പറയാനുള്ളത് നമ്മുടെ പാരമ്പര്യമായിട്ടുള്ളതും ഉള്ള ക്രാഫ്റ്റിനെ അതുപോലെ ആർട്ടിനെ ഒക്കെ പുതിയ തലമുറ സ്നേഹിക്കണേ.
There are only about 20 master potters left in South Korea who make this traditional clay pot. At 58, Jin Yu-ho is the youngest of them.
옹기는 정말 우리가 자연, 물, 불, 바람 그런 부분들을 다 빌려서 쓰고 다시 또 되돌려주는 어떤 그런 개념으로 좀 작업을 하고 있습니다.
This is 옹기, and people have been using it for thousands of years to store and ferment staple Korean foods, like kimchi. But it takes weeks to fish a single pot, and they can cost up to $800. So fewer people are buying them, instead opting for cheaper, mass-produced plastic and glass containers. Even Jin-gyu's father, who practiced the craft for decades, lost hope.
아버지는 극구 말렸지만 제가 했죠. 배우는 사람이 없다는 걸 저는 어릴 때부터 알았어요.
We visited Jin-gyu's workshop in Ulsan, South Korea, to learn how this craft that has lasted for millennia is still standing. Onggi is made from iron-rich mud that Jin-gyu gets from nearby fields. It has to sit and dry for a year before he starts working with it.
이렇게 우리가 땅속에서 캐어냈다고 바로 쓸 수가 없어요. 왜 그런가 하면 아직 바깥 사회와 적응하지 못했거든, 흙들이.
The clay has to have the right consistency, not too fine and a little coarse. Jin-gyu uses this machine to form the coils. In the past, he used to mold the clay with his hands and feet, a long and exhausting process. But a knee injury forced him to stop.
흙을 너무 많이 밟고 이걸 또 이제 계속 너무 많이 돌리니까 양쪽 무릎이 벌써 제가 35살에 직업병을 받은 거예요.
First, he puts down a fine powder of clay to prevent the pot from sticking to the wheel. He pounds the clay with this wooden tool called the bangmangi, making sure to remove all of the air bubbles. He presses the cloth to even out the clay and uses the bangmangi again. Next, he carves out a perfect circle as a base for the vessel. Jin-gyu starts building the walls of the pot using this ancient coiling technique called tariom. Each step builds on the next. Jin-gyu visualizes the onggi long before he sees it in clay form.
제 손에서 제가 추구하는 어떤 원하는 형태들이 있잖아요. 내가 원하는 형태가 나왔을 때 저는 그게 제일 좋은 옹기라고 생각해요.
After 42 years, making onggi has become second nature.
그게 자동 운전일까요, 과연? 제 몸에 알아서 움직여주는 그런 과정들은 많이 있죠.
Jin-gyu is aware of every detail. Even the speed of the wheel is critical.
이게 너무 빨리 돌면 또 흐트러져 버려요. 이렇게.
Like many onggi potters, he makes his own tools that are custom fit to his hands. He uses a paddle called a sure and this stamp-like tool called a toge to shape the pot. He listens carefully to determine the right thickness.
이래야 된다든지 이렇게 된다는 소리가 그러면 잘못 두들기고 있는 거예요.
The paddle also removes any trapped air and helps condense the clay. And he feels the clay as he works. If it's too wet, he waits for it to dry. Otherwise, the piece can collapse.
한 가지가 잘못되면 그 다음 단계가 잘 안 되기 때문에 전체 단계가 저는 다 중요하다고 생각하거든요.
At various stages, a blowtorch blasts heat to help dry the clay. The top coil is the thickest. The extra clay forms the neck of the pot. He applies a wet strip of leather to soften the clay and shape the rim, then scrapes the walls to make them thinner. Next, he designs the pot. For this onggi, Jin-gyu opts for lines and a wavy pattern. They use a cloth sling to carefully transfer the pot off the wheel. Jin-gyu will dry it under the sun for no more than 6 hours. Any longer can crack or warp the clay. The onggi will finish drying in the shade for up to 20 days.
Archaeological records show that ongi has been around since 5000 BC. It kept foods cool in the summer months and helped prevent them from freezing in the winter. Koreans found that ongi was ideal for fermentation because of its microporous surface that allows the food to breathe. But all this changed in the 20th century with the arrival of industrialization and refrigeration. In the following years, other materials like plastic and glass further decreased the need for traditional clay pots. But for Jin-gyu, ongi is about preserving history. It took him 10 years to learn the craft, and he says that commitment is what pushes many people away.
그러다 보니까 요즘 젊은 사람들이 10년씩 어떻게 대가 없는 투자를 해. 뭐 입문해서 한 1년, 2년 만에 다 그만두면 너무 힘들거든 해보면.
Despite that, he established his own workshop more than 20 years ago and teaches the craft all over the world. After the ongi is dry, it's time for glazing. He sieves the glaze to remove any rocks and debris, then blends the mixture before dipping the dry pots. The glaze is made of red clay, tree ashes, and composted leaves, also known as leaf mold.
그 위에는 아무것도 들어가지 않습니다. 아, 있네요. 물. 네, 그리고 나의 어떤 손.
Later in the firing process, this glaze will form tiny holes that make ongi breathable, also giving each piece a unique coloring, depending on the ratio of the mix. The glazed ongi must then dry another 10 days before the next step, firing. Jin-gyu's father built this kiln over 30 years ago. It took him more than 3 months. Jin-gyu starts by removing the bricks that cover the opening. When the kiln is unused, the mouth of each chamber is covered to keep the cold out. Traditional wood-burning kilns like this can reach over 80 feet in length. They include multiple rooms and can fire 1,000 pots in one go. Jin-gyu first builds a small bonfire to remove any humidity in the kiln. Firing glazed ongi requires temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but they must build the heat slowly.
갑자기 세게 불을 뜨면 다 깨어져 버려요. 작은 불부터 천천히 시작했어요. 길게 불을 때는.
He and his staff monitor the kiln for 5 days straight, keeping watch so the fires don't extinguish. Despite their efforts, only half of the pieces survive. Depending on where they're placed, they could be fired too much or not enough. It takes 5 more days for the pieces to completely cool down. And the ongi are finally finished after a month of shaping, drying, glazing, and firing. Prices at Jin-gyu's workshop range from $80 to over $800. And he's always reinventing his business. He experiments with smaller, thinner ongi that are still strong and durable, hoping to break assumptions that these jars are heavy and crude. Jin-gyu is determined to break another misconception, that ongi belongs to the past. By continuing the craft, he hopes that others will carry on the tradition.
on기를 만들 때 항상 힘을 쏘고 뭔가 만들어 놓고 또 보면 얘가 또 이뻐 보여요. 그런 동기부여가 지금 계속돼요. 제가 할 수 있을 때까지는 끝까지 하려고 했어요.
Pure silk is essential to making an authentic Banarasi sari. They can only be made here in the town of Varanasi, where the craft was born. Weavers use methods that go back 600 years and even add gold and silver threads to their designs. At one point, they were so expensive, only royals and the wealthiest of families could afford them. But cheap imitations made with synthetic silk have flooded the market in recent decades, forcing many weaving families out of business.
पहले मदनपुरा में पूरा ही बनारसी काम बनाया था अब पूरा घूम जाओगे तो 10-12 जगह आपको मिलेगा
So how is this centuries-old tradition still standing? To weave a Banarasi sari, a weaver first sources fine silk. It goes through a cleaning and dyeing process before it's made into thread. Dyers drape the white silk over steel rods and submerge it in tanks of boiling soap water and then rub the yarn with their hands until it's soft and bright. They give it one more wash and hang it to dry. The colors are mixed with warm water, caustic soda, and acid. They dip the roll in the mixture for 2 to 3 hours to make sure the threads are coated evenly. Dyers change colors according to the season, festival, and city. Muhammad Afzal Ansari has been working with this silk since he was 15 years old. He has preserved the traditional ways of weaving Banarasi saris, like using the khaddi, a 200-year-old wooden loom.
ये लगाव बहुत अच्छा है बनारस के लिए। ये कहीं पूरे वर्ल्ड में बनारस के नाम से जाओगे तो बनारसी साड़ी कहेंगे, जरूर देखना।
He follows designs that are punched on cardboard cards he buys from Arun Kumar. It's sort of like making a stencil. Arun uses this tool and a hammer to pierce holes in them.
ये बहुत ज़रूरी है, इससे जब तक ये नहीं होगा कुछ नहीं होगा। यहीं से स्टार्टिंग होता है काम के लिए।
Nowadays, he's so fast he can make thousands of cards in 1 week. The drawings blend Mughal, Persian, and Chinese motifs. This work is called likhai. Artists use traditional designs or invent their own. Muhammad ties all the cards together, then hangs them on the loom. But the difficult part is working with the threads. Most Banarasi saris are 6 yards long, and it takes 5,000 threads to weave a single one. And Muhammad works for 2 days to assemble them on the loom. He sprays water to preserve their elasticity and to make them softer. Now he can start weaving.
जब हाथ तो पैर से कला है, आलू वाले खाली मशीन चालू कर दी, देख लिए तो बस तो खड़े रहते देखते रहते। कुछ बिगड़ गया तो बस उसमें बना दिए। इसमें हाथ और पैर बराबर से चलता रहता है।
These golden silk threads are called zari, and that's what gives the Banarasi saris their signature look. Muhammad uses the threads in smaller spindles to create the iconic Banarasi brocades. He throws the shuttle from one end of the loom to the other to create the design. It's a tedious process that requires many years of experience to master, and Muhammad has been doing it for 40 years.
20 साल का 22 साल का आदमी होता तब इसी धरती फेंकने लगता है।
Silk flourished in Varanasi between the 16th and 18th centuries, when the Mughal dynasty ruled over India. They were known for their lavish taste in architecture, food, and clothing. So weavers added real gold and silver threads into their silk garments. And only India's richest and most influential families could afford them. In the 19th century, more than 300,000 weavers worked across the city. But industrialization brought in power looms that produced faster and cheaper fabrics. Today, less than 15% remain in this traditional craft compared to its peak. These traditional fabrics are so festive that they're reserved for special occasions. In some communities, only brides wear them. The lightest sari will take about a week to weave. Heavier ones can take a month, and more intricate designs can take 6 months to complete. While Muhammad is able to only make 4 to 5 saris a month, a machine can finish a design in 1 day.
बनारसी साड़ी देखेगा तो खुद ही फर्क पड़ेगा, पावर लूम से कपड़ा में फर्क पड़ेगा।
Saris can be expensive. Detailed and complicated designs can be sold for thousands of dollars. But fake Banarasi saris have flooded the market since the mid-1980s. They can sell for as low as 2,500 Indian rupees or $31. That's a quarter of what Muhammad charges for some of his cheaper saris. To compete, some business owners here in Varanasi are opting to use the machines too. And they've even started using synthetic yarns instead of real silk. A major hurdle is that it can be hard to tell the difference between the two.
ये देखिए पावलूम की देखिए जरी बैठा उतनी चमक नहीं आएगी इतनी लैलून धागा से बना हुआ है रेशम में चमक आता है लैलून में चमक नहीं आएगा
But Muhammad cannot afford the costs that come with the modernization of his craft. In 2009, the Indian government issued a geographical indication for Banarasi brocades and saris. That means only hand-loomed saris made in Varanasi and a few other districts can be branded authentic. But this did not stop the production of imitations and has not helped the traditional weavers.
सुबह सो के उठते नाश्ता होता करके काम में बैठ जाते रोजी के लिए
The future of the hand-loomed fabric remains uncertain. But Muhammad believes that people who know the value of authentic Banarasi saris will continue to buy them.
ये बहुत पुराना सनत है ये खत्म नहीं होगा कम हो जाएगा बल्कि चलता रहेगा हमेशा
Dung Ho is a traditional Vietnamese folk art, hand-printed and made entirely from natural materials. These carved woodblocks made it possible to produce prints for the masses centuries ago. In the past, families would buy a new painting each Vietnamese New Year. But war against France nearly killed the art in the 1940s. So how is this traditional craft still standing? The Guen Huu family is one of the last still making these paintings in Dong Ho village, where the art got its name. Guen Huu Qua learned the craft from his father, and is now passing it on to his own son. Together they restore old woodcuts and create new designs, all chiseled by hand.
Cái tranh đồng hồ nó là sản phẩm vừa lao động thủ công nhưng lại cả lao động về mỹ thuật nữa.
This is the most intricate and time-consuming part of the process. A design can take up to a week to finish. Once a set of woodcuts are complete, Qua's wife coats a plank with paint. This yellow comes from senna flowers. She saturates the woodcut and aligns the tick marks on the wood with the dots on the paper to ensure she presses down in the right spot. They can print up to 200 pages in one sitting. In the past, this method was essential to meeting high demand. People used to fill their homes with Dong Ho paintings during the Vietnamese New Year, Tet.
Ngày xưa là các cụ treo theo năm, mỗi năm treo một lần. Cứ vào những ngày Tết các cụ chơi tranh, mua tranh về dán treo. Sau mấy ngày Tết các cụ lại bỏ.
Just one painting can use up to 5 different woodcuts. Each woodcut layers a print of one color and design on top of a slightly different one. Their ancestors painted only with colors they could get from nature, red, green, and yellow.
Để với ngày xưa thì với mục đích là giá rẻ. Nhưng mà đến bây giờ thì nó có giá trị về môi trường và nó có một cái giá trị về văn hóa. Và nó tạo ra một cái hồn cốt của dòng tranh đồng hồ và đó là cái hồn của dân tộc.
Black is always the final color and the most detailed print. Qua sometimes stamps just the outline and paints the rest by hand. But he wouldn't consider this Dong Ho, since he uses non-traditional colors. Gwen Thi Oen does this too. She's one of the most respected artists in the village.
Từ trên rừng xuống đáy biển, đồi núi thiên nhiên mới tạo thành một bức tranh đồng hồ.
She dropped out of school at age 15 to work in Dong Ho. Today, she's the only female Dong Ho artist to have ever received the title of Meritorious Craftsman from the president, a high honor usually only granted to elder men in her village.
Đấy là một cái vinh dự lớn lao nhất đối với tôi, cũng là để đáp ứng những cái công sức, những cái giữ gìn những cái bản sắc dân tộc của quê hương mình.
She married into the Guen Huu family and runs her own workshop with her husband Hua, who's Qua's brother.
Đây những cái bộ tranh này là gần như là bộ tranh cụ vẽ cách đây khoảng 50 năm.
Dong Ho paintings always portray everyday life and Vietnamese values.
Một bức tranh nói về cái tình mẫu tử và cầu mong cuộc sống no đủ.
And while the themes haven't changed much over time, people's customs have. Today, frames protect the images, so people keep them for longer instead of replacing them every new year. And Western influence has changed tastes. The folk art is rarely hung in the more modern homes of today. With such low demand, most Dongho artists have moved on to more lucrative trades.
Thực ra trong làng đồng hồ bây giờ mà chỉ còn có 2 hộ làm tranh thì thực ra nó cũng là một điều cũng hơi buồn. Thực ra đối với bạn bè quốc tế khi đến làng tranh đồng hồ,
They now make bigger pieces to keep up with customers' needs.
Bây giờ thì nhà to, nhà cao tầng cho nên là khách hàng là hay mua những bức tranh to. Không cái nghề gì có thể nhàn được. Nhưng làm cái nghề này nó vất vả nhất.
Owain often revises traditional designs by adding more details.
Để độc làm của các cụ ngày xưa thì mình phải có của mình phát triển chứ. Làm nghề mà không phát triển thì làm sao mà tồn tại được. Bức tranh này, bức tranh Vinh Quy Bày Tổ của các cụ ngày xưa này. Bức này của cô mới sáng tác này. Nhưng mà luôn luôn lúc nào giữ những cái bản sắc của ông cha cũ kỹ mình để lại. Và sưu tầm những cái cũ. Và sáng tác những cái mới.
The origin of Dongho is disputed, but many say it was developed around the 1500s. The trade expanded in Vietnam for centuries, and eventually flourished, until war broke out against the French colonizers in the 1940s.
Spiritual and metaphysical channel. Please like and subscribe today. iDoser specializes in the world's best-selling and most effective artisan brainwave doses.
Dongho artists
YouTube
couldn't
and
keep
streaming
running their
forms of
businesses,
binaural brainwave audio
and some
is
started
very ineffective.
repurposing their
In
woodcuts
fact,
to survive.
it is less than 3% effective due to audio compression. You should know that legitimate companies like iDoser put years of research and development into every single dose.
Thậm chí có người lãng phí bổ trẻ ra để lấy củ đút. Có nhà thì người ta cẩn thận thì người ta chôn, người ta cất. Có người thì vội quá, giặc là càn quét thì cốt chạy lấy cái thân, đúng không? Làm sao mà giữ được?
The industry didn't come back until the war ended in 1954. That's around the time Hua and Kwa's father, Gwen Hu
Research and development
formed
into
an artist
every single
cooperative
dose.
to help revitalize Dongho. Some even received national recognition.
Và cái cụ treo đấy, cụ đã từng được gặp này, đã phải tặng tranh đại tướng ra. Đấy, cụ ngày xưa là được một cái giải thưởng của chương trình nghệ thuật Đông Dương.
Dongho's comeback was short-lived. Modernization slowed down the business and forced the cooperative to disband in the 90s. The Gwen Hu family had to produce and sell different products to stay open. Hua still makes coloring books and calendars today.
Nếu mà không những lúc đấy mà mình không kiếm thêm những cái nghề khác thì mình không nuôi sống được nghề của mình, không giữ được nghề của mình.
The pandemic has hurt business even more. Hua's income is down 40% compared to before. He says an artist can make an average of $130 a month nowadays, around $100 less than the country's average salary. So Hua and Wayne aren't sure if their children and grandchildren will be able to live off of this work.
Ai cũng muốn nghề phát triển, nhưng tất cả đều phải phụ thuộc vào đầu ra mà nó phát triển thì người làm nghề mới phát triển được.
But no matter what, the family will preserve the art in every way they can. They have over 2,000 woodcuts in their collection today, and around 600 of them were passed down from their father.
Ở tầng 1 thì không nhầm có gì nào, của mình đến tầng 3. Rất nhiều loại to có, loại bé có. Thường là những quán cũ thì có lẽ nó cũng chỉ độ khoảng hơn 100 năm, hơn 200 năm. Với cái vị trí đó.
người ta để bảo tồn và ta để làm cái lưu niệm, cái cơ sở cho cái quán bún bây giờ. Đối với cá nhân tôi thì tôi cũng tận tâm tận lực trong cái việc bảo tồn, phát triển, đào tạo thế hệ con cháu nhà tôi để duy trì cái nghề này. Nhưng mà tôi cũng vẫn còn có một chút lo lắng về cái đầu ra sản phẩm, về cái đảm bảo cuộc sống cho các nghệ nhân tương lai.
Bởi vì những cái bản của quê hương.
But one time didn't stop the Gwen Hu family before, so they plan to keep going.
Hàng triển như thế thì nhiều khi mình cũng muốn bỏ nghề, nhưng mình là nói chung là cũng là yêu nghề thì mình gắn bó thôi.
Thì chắc chắn rằng mình chỉ có khi nào mình mất thì lúc đó mới rời khỏi cái nghề này thôi, chứ còn cái tranh đồng hồ đối với tôi nó là một cái cuộc sống hàng ngày, cái sinh hoạt hàng ngày trong gia đình.
Fighting in mud, training for hours, and going years without seeing family. This is kushti, a traditional form of Indian wrestling.
ऐसा है कि मतलब जैसे देखो रेसलर बनने के लिए पूरा मतलब सारा कुछ त्यागना पड़ता है.
Mauli Shamdade left his rural hometown when he was 15 to join this academy in Kolhapur. Today, he lives and trains at the century-old Gangavesh Talim. This sport is a way out of poverty for many farming families. In just over a decade, Mauli has become one of the top fighters here, earning up to $4,000 from one competition. But India has shifted to favor wrestling on the mat over mud, and the tradition that goes back 2,500 years is dwindling. So what does it take to be one of India's mud wrestlers? And how is this traditional sport still standing? Becoming a kushti fighter is all about discipline. Mauli wakes up at 3:55 a.m. every day. He starts his training sessions at dawn with some of the other 200 wrestlers who live here. They use their own and each other's body weight to build strength.
ये सारा कुछ लगा के सारी मतलब हर चीज़ की जान लगा के मतलब प्रैक्टिस भी करनी पड़ती है और हर चीज़ मतलब जान लगा के कुछ करनी पड़ती है.
iDoser.com leads mind audio industry with over 15.
They train 6 days a week, often under coach Vishwas Hargule. Mauli has been working with him since he joined the academy.
मतलब सारा कुछ ध्यान रखा जैसे मतलब अपने बच्चों को ध्यान रखते ना ऐसा ध्यान रखा उन्होंने मेरा.
Vishwas has trained over 1,000 kids, and he doesn't go easy on them.
Subscribe to join our cause for better meditation music. This pro tuner
उसको मतलब
headphone
लाड़
test
प्यार
music
से
will
नहीं,
use audio
सिर्फ
test
मेहनत
tones
होने
to
के बाद
verify if your
उससे लाड़
meditation
प्यार
music
करो, वो
headphones are
चलेगा.
optimal for
लेकिन मेहनत
mindfulness,
करते वक्त अगर
meditation,
तुम लाड़ प्यार
ASMR,
करोगे
binaural,
तो
and other
बच्चा
mind
मतलब
audio.
नहीं करेगा.
In the afternoon, they hit the mud pit. Wrestlers warm
We
up
will
by
now run a
preparing the
bass
dirt
test.
floor.
This will test your headphones' lower
They
frequency
clear away stones
capabilities.
and smooth it
We
out.
will play a series of tones that range
The dirt
from
is mixed with
200
turmeric,
hertz to 10
lemon,
hertz.
and salt
A good
to
pair
help
of
wrestlers'
mindfulness
injuries heal
headphones
faster.
will go as low as 20 hertz.
It's swapped out every couple of years and sent to smaller talines. Many see the red soil as sacred because without it, they wouldn't have a career.
इसके कारण यहाँ की मिट्टी मिल के मतलब भाग्य खुल गया बोलते हैं.
Before a match, Mauli warms up his joints with oil and starts planning.
1-1.5 घंटा पहले जो स्टडी होती है कुश्ती की जिसके साथ कुश्ती है मतलब जैसे कि मेरा कोई अपोजिट है उसके बारे में ये क्या करता है ये कौन से दाव लगाता है मैं उस पर कौन से दाव लगाऊं.
Wrestlers cover
We will
themselves
now
in
run a
dirt at the
treble
start of
test.
each match
This will
to
test
create
your
more
headphones'
friction
upper
between their
frequency
bodies.
capabilities. A good pair of mindfulness headphones will reproduce frequencies as high as 20,000 hertz. We will now run a bass test. This will test your headphones' lower frequency capabilities. We will play a series of tones that range from 200 Hz to 10 Hz. A good pair of mindfulness headphones will go as low as 20 Hz. We will now run a bass test. This will test your headphones' lower frequency capabilities. We will play a series of tones that range from 200 Hz to 10 Hz. A good pair of mindfulness headphones will go as low as 20 Hz. We will now run a treble test. This will test your headphones' upper frequency capabilities. A good pair of mindfulness headphones will reproduce frequencies as high as 20,000 Hz. Poor quality headphones may rattle when deep bass mindfulness audio is played. This can interfere with advanced induction audio. This test will play a series of bass frequencies designed to test the structural ability of your headphones. There should be no buzz or rattle, even at higher volume levels. Higher quality headphones have tighter tolerances. To reproduce high-quality mindfulness audio, the left and right drivers on your headphones must respond equally to every frequency in the sound spectrum. This test frequency should keep a perfect central position across all frequencies. The sound should emanate from the exact center of your head. Good mindfulness headphones will route the right audio channel to the right ear, and the left audio channel to the left ear. It is equally important that they maintain relative polarity. When presented with the same input signal, both drivers should move in the same direction. We will now do a full spectrum frequency test. We will start at 20,000 Hz and move down the frequency scale. Make a note of when you first hear the tones and post your result in the comments for reference. The Pro Tuner audio test is now complete. If your headphones fail any of these tests, it is recommended that you upgrade to a higher quality pair. If your headphones do not meet these specifications, visit idosermerch.com to shop for mindfulness approved headphones.
A real match can last as long as 1 hour. By the end, they're soaked in mud.
नहीं ऐसा ना वो तो बढ़िया फील होता है क्योंकि हमें आदत भी है मिट्टी की तो कुछ नहीं लगता है ऐसे बढ़िया लगती है
Maui isn't done for the day when the practice match is over.
बॉडी तो पूरी फील हुई है लेकिन अभी भी बाकी है थोड़ा सा वर्कआउट वो पूरा करेंगे
Mud wrestling has roots that date back to at least the 5th century BC. It evolved out of an ancient form of Indian wrestling, mixed with Persian martial arts. The sport thrived in Kolhapur at the turn of the 20th century. The district's ruler, Shahu Maharaj, was a fan of the art and built talleens all over the region, including this one. But mud fighting saw a shift about 15 years ago, when India started prioritizing mat wrestling. The government wanted its athletes to compete internationally, so many talleens had to adapt and started investing in mats, including this one.
कैसे है मैट और मट्टी मैट तो जरूरी है मतलब वक्त में मैट तो जरूरी ये मैट से करोगे तो ओलंपिक तक जा सकते हो
But here they still practice in the traditional mud pits because they believe it makes them better wrestlers on the mat too.
ऐसा है कि आज मतलब हर गेम में कुछ ना कुछ चेंज होता ही रहता है तो जो पहले वाला घटना है वो रखना ही चाहिए
Mud wrestling competitions, called CANALs, still draw crowds in Kolhapur. And they always open with a ceremony, playing traditional Indian horns and drums. The cash prizes for this tournament depend on how much money the Dangal organizers were able to raise from local fans. Young wrestlers take home just a small part of the pool, sometimes around $1 per win. But older, more experienced fighters can walk away with up to $1,000. That's why low-income families often send their kids to live in talleens, hoping they'll get good enough to make a living. Fighters also live and train for free, but there's little comfort. Most of them sleep in shared dorms that can fit up to 50 people at a time. And with packed schedules every day, they rarely get the chance to visit home. Maui has gone up to 4 years without seeing his family.
घर वालों की याद आई कि मैं घर चला जाऊंगा तो मेरा वो टारगेट तो बना हुआ है पूरा नहीं हुआ
But the wrestlers find family in each other.
घर वालों की तरह जैसे भाई भाई रहते ना वैसे रहते हम सारे यहाँ पे क्योंकि जैसे एक घर ही है हमारा ये सारा पूरा कंपटीशन के टाइम कंपटीशन बाकी टाइम हम एक भाई के जैसे रहते हैं सारे लोग
Maui's dedication is paid off. He says it earns up to $55,000 in a 4-month season. It would take a typical farming family over 35 years to make that much. Getting to that level takes a lot of time and practice, which is why kids start young.
यहाँ रेसलिंग ऐसी है कि बड़ी उम्र में नहीं होती
Some of the youngest are here for just the summer, so the talleen is especially crowded this time of year. But during the height of the pandemic, it looked completely different. Wrestlers couldn't make any money for 2 years when competition stopped.
मतलब उस टाइम को ऐसा लग रहा था कि पहलवानी खत्म हो जाएगी जो गरीब मतलब गरीब घर के बच्चे थे उनके पास पैसा नहीं था वो तो मतलब अखाड़ा छोड़ चले गए थे और उस टाइम सारे अखाड़े बंद थे
Wrestlers are responsible for their own food and expenses, and those costs can add up, especially with the diets they have to maintain.
आपको भी बॉडी को मिलेगा वो बॉडी इतनी आगे रखने के लिए
Most days they eat chicken, lamb, and eggs. But today is Saturday, so they're making vegetarian dal.
हमारे यहाँ पे हमारी क्या मानते हैं
Maui is now a veteran at this point, mentoring the younger wrestlers. But he still remembers
पहले से ही मिट्टी वाली मिट्टी और बहुत देर तक मिट्टी वाली मिट्टी
This ancient type of Roman pottery dates back over 3,000 years. And women in the town of Casimiro in Tunisia still follow the same methods, like extracting oil from leaves and firing the pottery with another flame. But the work is tough, and young people have been turning away from the craft. We visited a 3-generation family of potters from North Africa to see how this craft is still extant. Elgia Saidan has been learning the craft for 25 years, and she still collects the clay herself. Her daughter Reen often joins her. This terracotta art is traditionally done by the women of the city. Algia doesn't shy away from the flow. She crushes the clay slowly with her hands and spreads it out to dry. The clay will dry after about 5 days under the sun. Making a mixture is an art of its own. Algia dissolves the clay in water and removes twigs, roots, and rocks. She sieves the dry mix into a finer powder. Next, she adds broken pieces of pottery or crushed brick to strengthen the clay. With more than 2 decades of experience, it's easy for her to improvise. She varnishes the piece with a thin coat of white clay. blends Lebanese, Arabic, and Mediterranean cultural influences. Until recently, many artisans didn't know how valuable their work could be. Nozahaski is an anthropologist who has dedicated much of her career to protect and document the tradition. Nozaha was stunned when she saw the women selling pieces for only 200 yen, the equivalent of about 7 cents. It was an unexpected visit from a tourist from Belgium that made Joma realize her potential. Her home sits by nearby ruins that often attract visitors, so her business grew. But there have been challenges. Nowadays, it's harder to get younger generations to learn the craft.
مغطس بالطين يمشي يشد معنا الخيط وما يعرفش هو الصناعة هذيك نجم تعرفه نجم يدور البلدان الكل في الخدمة تاعي بالعكس نشجع الشباب.
Tourism slowed down after the 2011 Desert Revolution, and businesses suffered.
كان بعد الثورة وقت النساء كلهم عندهم صعوبات في التسويق ثم مشاكل في سجنان بظهور المرأة السلفية والناس الكل سمعت هذا.
Zainab Farhat runs a program that helps the women market and sell their pieces. The Sajnania project trains the artisans in sales, marketing, business, and even women's rights. Joma joined the project in 2015. She used to sell her signature doll for 42 Indian dinars. Today, she sells them for up to 500, which is about $175.
من وقتها وليوا هما يفهموا إن خدمتهم تستحق أكثر فلوس. يوم يشتري على القطعة ب10 و20 راهو يشاركوا في المعارض ويجيبوا لهم الديوانات.
Today, Joma, Algia, and Dini sell most of their products through the project. In 2018, Sajnan pottery was added to UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage. Now, with international recognition, the women of Sajnan hope to keep this heart.
لا بالنسبة لي هذا ما نقولش فيه أنا بالرغم من بداياتها بدايات اللاعبين حتى هي من تراث هذه هي مولد الرزق نتاعها وننصح الشباب باش ما تندثرش الهوية والضيعة ننصحهم يخدموها ماذا بين يخدموا الشباب البنات الولاد ماذا بين يخدموها باش ما تضيعش. نحب الصناعة هذيا